Sergius Paulus and Dionysius, the Areopagite, are sometimes appealed to in an attempt to defeat Io. However, neither of them dismantle the Io paradigm. In fact, both reinforce its covenantal logic once read through first-century categories rather than modern assumptions. For one, there is zero conclusive evidence from the scriptures that Sergius Paulus was a non-Israelite either before or after his mention in Acts 13. In contrast, Josephus records many Roman officials and Greeks who became proselytes. Source: Antiquities of the Jews 14.110, 20.17. First-century synagogues were full of these God-fearers. Acts 13 occurs in the synagogue circuit, where Paul was preaching to Jews and God-fearers, Gentile proselytes attached to Judaism. In this environment, Gentile didn't simply mean pagan foreigner. It often referred to non-Judean adherents of the Jewish faith, converts or descendants of the dispersed tribes per Acts 13:43, 48, or even proselytes. Thus, Sergius Paulus fits the known pattern of a Gentile proselyte or sympathizer drawn into Israel's restored covenant community. This means that Sergius Paulus was already part of Israel's covenantal structure and no longer a Gentile. Regarding Dionysius, Paul's Mars Hill discourse follows his usual pattern. He speaks to devout persons. In the synagogue Acts 17:17, before addressing the philosophers at the Areopagus, Paul was in Athens only because his companions had brought him there to escape Jews who were seeking to kill him at Berea. In other words, Paul didn't march into the Areopagus to evangelize pagans. He was reasoning first in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace only because he happened to be there daily. The philosophers overheard him discussing Jesus and the resurrection and dragged him before the council to explain himself. Additionally, Paul was summoned, not self-appointed, into a philosophical hearing. This was defensive testimony, not a universal mission campaign. Once before the Areopagus, Paul doesn't say, "I've come to save you." He begins by contextualizing Israel's God within their cultural language, then pivots immediately to covenantal judgment. He has fixed a day on which he will judge the oikoumene, inhabited empire, by the man he has appointed, Acts chapter 17:31. This is not a global invitation, it's a warning to the Greco-Roman world that had become entangled with Israel's covenant corruption, especially the Judean authorities allied with Rome. The day points to the coming AD 70 judgment on Israel that would upend that entire order that the Roman Empire was part of. In other words, Paul was warning non-Israelite philosophers that the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jews would have significant repercussions throughout the oikoumene of the Roman Empire. Paul's reply to the curious philosophers also would have benefited people who were covenantally linked to Israel, people who may have been in the wider audience. Paul's method here parallels every other speech in Acts. He declares the risen Christ as proof that Israel's prophetic promises are fulfilled and that judgment is near. The philosophers simply happened to overhear that message. Given the heavy Jewish presence in Athens, Dionysius could easily have been a God-fearer or diaspora Israelite within that community. Luke's pattern throughout Acts is consistent. Those labeled Gentiles are almost always covenant-linked people like Cornelius, Lydia, and Sergius Paulus. So, rather than destroying the Io paradigm, Sergius Paulus and Dionysius, the Areopagite, confirm it. Both exemplify Israel's covenant expansion into the diaspora world, not Gentile inclusion into a new religion. Both show fulfillment of Israel's prophetic restoration, the light reaching those once estranged. Neither text presents salvation of random, non-Israelite pagans. Both fit the covenant inclusion model, consistent with Hosea, Isaiah, and Paul's theology. Aside from the civic and ethnic identity of Sergius, Paulus, and Dionysius, it stands to reason that if they were real pagan non-Israelites completely disconnected from the covenant world of ancient Israel, then that would be entirely inconsistent with the rest of the narrative and would be very problematic. For example, 1. If Dionysius and Sergius Paulus were ethnic pagans with no covenant link to Israel, they were never under the Torah's jurisdiction. They could not have broken it, incurred its curse, or needed atonement from it. Christ's death and resurrection were defined as the redemption from the curse of the law per Galatians 3:13 and Galatians 4:4-5. That curse simply does not extend to people who were never party to that covenant. To place Gentiles under it rewrites Paul's argument and flattens the distinction that gives the gospel its covenant meaning. Paul's entire theology of salvation assumes a covenant problem. Israel failed under the law and needed deliverance. Christ became a servant to the circumcision to confirm the promises given to the fathers, Romans 15:8. 2. If Sergius Paulus and Dionysius were outsiders to that story, they had no transgression counted against them, Romans 5:13. Sin is not imputed when there is no law. They could not be justified because justification presumes standing before a covenant court whose statutes you've violated. Universalizing salvation to include those never under judgment empties the cross. Of its forensic logic, it becomes cosmic sentiment instead of covenant resolution. 3. All New Testament salvation texts draw from Israel's prophetic restoration promises. Isaiah 40:49, Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36-37. The Messiah was to save his people from their sins per Matthew 1:21, gather the lost sheep of the house of Israel per Matthew chapter 15:24, and bring the dispersed tribes home. If the redeemed are non-Israelite pagans, the prophetic storyline fractures. The servant restores everyone except the nation he was sent to. By contrast, if Dionysius and Sergius Paulus were diaspora Israelites or covenant proselytes within Israel's scattered world, their belief fulfills those very prophecies instead of violating them. 4. Paul's courtroom imagery of law, condemnation, justification, and righteousness depends on covenant standing. Gentiles without law may be moral creatures, but they are not covenant defendants per Romans 2:12-14. Christ's death expiated covenantal guilt, not generic immorality. To apply his atonement universally requires inventing a universal law, never mentioned in Scripture, a concept foreign to both testaments. 5. Every evangelistic event in Acts begins in a synagogue or among God-fearers already attached to Israel's covenant framework. Per Acts 13:14, 26, 43, 14, 1, 17, 23, 4. If Luke had suddenly introduced purely pagan Gentiles with no covenant connection, the entire narrative trajectory of restoration would collapse. But if Dionysius and Sergius Paulus were Israelites in Roman office or proselytes among the diaspora, the pattern remains intact, Israel's exiles hearing, believing, and being restored before the end of the age. 6. If Dionysius and Sergius Paulus were true Gentiles, they were never under Sinai's covenant. They never bore its curse. They required no redemption from it. They could not be participants in the new covenant, which was promised explicitly, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah per Jeremiah 3:1-31. Thus, their inclusion would make the Messiah's mission transcend the very covenants that defined it. Contradicting his own words, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. These 6 bullet points do more than neutralize the traditional view. They make the covenantal connection hypothesis the stronger historical and theological explanation. While Scripture doesn't explicitly label either man and Israelite, the covenantal framework of Acts, Paul's theology of law and redemption, and the synagogue-based missionary pattern all converge to make that identity far more probable than the idea that they were Gentile pagans with no prior link to Israel. To classify Dionysius and Sergius Paulus as non-Israelite Gentiles turns the redemptive logic of the New Testament upside down. Redemption, forgiveness, justification, and covenant renewal presuppose law, curse, and covenant. Membership, all of which belonged exclusively to Israel. Outside that framework, there is no transgression to forgive and no covenant to restore. Hence, identifying Sergius Paulus and Dionysius as Israelites or proselytes within the covenant world is not a semantic convenience. It is the only reading that preserves the coherence of the entire redemptive narrative. Another line of argument sometimes levelled at I.O. is that the civic offices of Sergius Paulus and Dionysius required them to be non-Israelites. Is that true? Let's see. It's true that Sergius Paulus in Acts 13 and Dionysius the Areopagite in Acts 17 held offices within Roman and Athenian civic systems. But Roman office law proves only their cultural citizenship, not their genealogical origin. By the 1st century, diaspora Israelites and long-assimilated descendants of deported tribes could hold local or imperial positions anywhere in the empire. Josephus and Philo both record Jews of high civic standing throughout Asia Minor and Greece. Moreover, Sergius Paulus's belief follows synagogue preaching Acts 13:5, 1443. The same covenant environment that consistently yields believing Israelites and proselytes. Dionysius' belief occurs after Paul's speech referencing Israel's God and the resurrection from the dead, a uniquely Jewish concept foreign to Stoic or Epicurean thought. Luke gives no hint that Dionysius remained a pagan philosopher. He identifies with Paul's message, which itself was Israel's fulfillment gospel. Their civic posts don't determine their covenant identity any more than Cornelius' Roman centurion rank did. By the mid-1st century, provincial offices, even those bearing traditional titles like proconsul or areopagite, had become increasingly administrative, not hereditary ethnic. Rome's empire integrated freedmen, proselytes, and provincials into its bureaucratic hierarchy through imperial grants of citizenship and status. Josephus himself notes that Herod's Idumean lineage did not prevent him from being granted king of the Jews by the Roman Senate per Antiquities of the Jews 14.385 to 387. Agrippa II, ethnically Judean, was entrusted with procuratorial authority under Roman oversight per Tacitus, History 288. Claudius Caesar's reforms, in AD 48 to 54, opened curial and senatorial positions to provincial elites across the empire per Suetonius, Claudius 25. The Athenian Areopagus, by Paul's day, was not the ancient hereditary council of pure Athenian birth, but a judicial college appointed from ex-archons under Roman supervision. Its composition had broadened. For example, Aristian of Athens was a Roman citizen per Philostratus. Lives of the Sophists, 1.25. Thus, to say Sergius Paulus's office proves his genealogy is historically overreaching. He was certainly Roman by law, but that doesn't prove he was non-Israelite by descent or covenantal relation. Citizenship and ethnicity were not synonymous in Rome's provincial administration. Luke doesn't call Sergius Paulus a Roman Gentile or contrast him with Jews. He notes his belief per Acts 13:12. To show that the gospel reached into the Roman world, that is, into Israel's diaspora context under imperial rule. There is actual evidence of Israelites, both Judeans and diaspora descendants, serving in imperial and provincial roles. For example, Tiberius Julius Alexander, an Alexandrian Jew and nephew of Philo, served as procurator of Judea. D. 46–48, and later prefect of Egypt, the highest Roman provincial office. He was ethnically Israelite, yet held Roman provincial rank per Josephus. Wars 2.220–221. Herod Agrippa I and II, though of Judean, Idumean descent, governed under Roman. Appointment showing that high civic office did not demand ethnic Roman origin. The Acts of the Apostles itself mentions Alexandrian Jews and freedmen of Cyrene and Cilicia, per Act 6:9, proving diaspora Israelites participated in cosmopolitan Roman structures. Therefore, there's no default that bars Israelites from such posts, the empire's patronage. System was fluid, and conversion, adoption, or provincial service often blurred ethnic lines. Thus, holding a Roman or Athenian title no more proved Gentile ancestry than holding U.S. citizenship proves Anglo-Saxon descent. The only historical claim Io needs is that Israelites and proselytes were scattered through the empire and functioned within its administrative systems, facts no historian disputes. Josephus names Jewish governors, tax collectors, and administrators across Asia Minor and Greece. Per Antiquities of the Jews 14.21, 19.278. Philo attests to Jews in every city of the empire engaged in civic commerce, per Legat 281. That's precisely the environment where a diaspora Israelite or proselyte could be known. By a Greek or Roman name, hold provincial status, and still belong covenantally to Israel. Nothing in the historical record forbids that. So, Sergius Paulus and Dionysius, holding civic positions doesn't prove that they were non-Israelites ethnically or covenantally. It's therefore reasonable within the Io framework to interpret them as possibly belonging to Israel's dispersed or proselytized population.